Welcome to the project management introduction chapter. Overall, there are going to be about 13 chapters. So we are going to cover the entire PMBOK guide, which is the 6th edition. So starting this year, the PMI Institute has in fact changed the entire exam guidelines for PMP certification. Okay, so now all new PMP certified individuals would have to go through the 6th edition, which is the current PMBOK guide. So this is the first chapter, and I'm going to cover the project management introduction guidelines, what a project is, and so on. So let's jump right in and let's begin. There are about 17 slides, so bear with me on this one. We are going to cover a lot of concepts, but I'm going to walk you through step by step, so in a manageable chunk, so that you actually understand how project management works along with the concepts as well. First, what is a project and PMBOK? So a project is a temporary endeavor undertaken to create a unique product, service, or result. What that means is whenever we call everything a project, by the way, right? So whether it's a small task or a number of tasks, it's a project essentially. It has a start, it has an end. So you take something from the beginning, you add a value to it, right? Or you do things to it, and it becomes something else. So that's essentially a project, right? You could also categorize that as a number of tasks. That's why it's called a temporary endeavor, right? So it's not permanent. So you start from point A, and then you end at point D, for example. PMI, the Project Management Institute, defines the project management body of knowledge, which is known as PMBOK, now we know, as a term that describes the knowledge within the profession of project management. The PM body of knowledge includes proven traditional practices that are widely applied, as well as innovative practices that are emerging in the profession. So it does two things. The management body basically looks at all of the historical practices of project management that are widely applied. In addition, it also comes up or creates innovative practices that are emerging, such as new trends in project management, maybe new tools that we use in project management. So this particular institute or this particular organization kind of has twofold objectives. So we understand what a project is and what stands for, or the abbreviation for, PMBOK. Here's what I mentioned earlier. So for instance, again, definition of a simple project: you have a current state, in other words, point A, and then you have a future state, which is a point D or F or whatever it is. So projects drive change in organizations. So whichever company you're working with, or if you wish to be a project manager, or if you are a project manager, in fact, what essentially you're doing is changing the state from your current state within the organization to a future state, which you hope to achieve. And during the process, you're actually conducting several tasks or project activities, so to speak. And projects enable business value creation. So the whole idea is to create something for the organization so that the organization, in fact, achieves a greater value. So very simple, yet very important in concept. So as the business value increases on the vertical axis, right, on the y-axis, so does time on the x-axis, which is the horizontal axis. But the idea is fairly simple: from current state to a future state, and in between you have various project activities. How do projects get initiated? So the project's initiation context. Several factors, in fact, come into play when we talk about a project. The factors influence an organization's ongoing operations and business activities or strategies. And leaders respond to these factors in order to keep organization viable. So let's say you're into a project where you need to roll out 1,000 computers within the organization, or you're upgrading hardware of thousands of these computers and so on. So the project could be anything. or you're developing a certain software, that could be a project. No matter what essentially the project is, leaders would respond to these factors in order to keep the organization viable. Projects provide the means for companies or organizations to successfully make the change necessary to deal with these factors. And the factors ultimately should link to the strategic objectives or goals of the company and the business value of each project. So essentially, 4 broad areas that you need to kind of take a look at and know. First, the legal or social requirements that impact the project or that becomes part of the project. Then you need to create, improve, or fix products, processes, or service as your project goes from one step to the other. Next, implement the change, business, or technological strategies. That also becomes a formidable part of the project. And then, of course, satisfy the upper management, senior management, or the stakeholders, their requests or needs. All of these factors kind of go hand in hand within a particular project. And that's how the project initiation context entails all of these factors. The key definitions of various projects, programs, and portfolios. So the entire concept of project management, you can kind of categorize that as part of being projects or programs or portfolios. Again, these are just definitions. And if you would like to pursue your PMP certification, just kind of memorize this. It's fairly straightforward. As we move forward, you'll get the key concepts. So a project, again, is a temporary endeavor which you undertake to create a unique product, service, or result from point A to point B. Programs is a group of projects, okay? That's all it is. If you have programs, or sometimes you've heard of the title called program manager, right? So there's a project manager and there's a program manager. Likewise, there could be a portfolio manager. Each of these individuals have unique roles and responsibilities. So since we know what a project is, a program is just a group of projects. So this person, who's a program manager, for instance, is now managing multiple projects. Could be subsidiary programs and program activities that are managed in a coordinated manner to obtain benefits not available from managing them individually. Portfolios, on the other hand, is a collection of project programs, subsidiary portfolios, and operations managed as a group to achieve strategic objectives, right? So you have projects, then you have programs, and then you have the entire portfolio. Here's a visual diagram that's easier to identify. So since you know the concept, it's easier to see and just kind of analyze and say, oh, that makes sense. So the portfolio view allows organizations or companies to see how the strategic goals are reflected within a particular portfolio. So this particular view also enables the implementation and coordination of appropriate portfolio, program, and project governance. And all of these coordinated governance simply allows authorized allocation of human resources, for example, financial resources, physical resources, based on the expected performance and benefits. So you may have a strategy that your company has developed for a particular project. It has created a sample portfolio. Within the portfolio, you have various programs, and each program has projects. And then at the bottom, you'll have the shared resources and stakeholders interacting with each of these projects, supplying whatever is necessary for project success. Key points is portfolio, projects, and then programs. Here's the project lifecycle. Of course, it's a temporary endeavor, right? Remember, you start from point A and then you end at point B or any other point. So a project lifecycle is simply a series of phases or steps that a project passes through from its start to its completion. But it's a sequential process, right? So you go from point A to B to C to D and so on. And then there are times where certain complex projects may entail taking the latter steps earlier, okay? But we'll get to that later. But right now, just think of this as different series of phases that a project passes through from its starts to its completion. So the project lifecycle also provides the basic framework for managing the project. And this framework applies regardless of the specific project work involved. The phases may be sequential, iterative, or overlapping, as I mentioned earlier. So all projects can be mapped to a generic life cycle. So at this point, just think of a project life cycle as being a process or a series of steps. So essentially, you start the project, then there are organization or organizing and preparing the project tasks and details, who's going to do what things are required, how do we talk to vendors, and so on. The third phase, for example, or the third step would be carrying out the actual work, getting all the manpower, for instance, to do the work, who's going to do what, and so on. And then monitoring all the work. Quality control, for instance, is also part of this, carrying out the work. And then the end of the project, where the project finishes, and then you finally close the project. Now, within the life cycle, of course, you have process groups, such as initiating processes, then you have the planning steps, then you have the execution part phase, you have monitoring and controlling processes, and then closing processes. So each of these basically are knowledge areas. Okay, fairly straightforward. The important key takeaway in this slide is that you ought to remember that you start, which is the initiation process, then you plan, you execute, you monitor, and you close. So that's the basic framework of the project lifecycle. Once again, typical project phases may be separated into distinct phases or subcomponents. And these subcomponents or phases are generally given names simply to indicate the type of work done within that particular phase. So some examples of the names may include concept development, feasibility study, customer requirements, solution development, design, prototype, build, test, transition, commissioning project, milestone review, and lessons learned. Once again, these are just subcomponents of each of those phases. So for instance, the initiation phase could contain 2 or 3 subcomponents. Then the planning phase could also contain 3 or 4 or 5 of these subcomponents, and so on. And again, these are not set in stone. You can have other subcomponents as well that relate to that particular project phase. So here are the project management process groups, okay, and the respective knowledge area mapping. The knowledge areas, for instance, include the project integration management, project scope management, project schedule management. Then you may also have the various phases that we just talked about in the previous slide, from the initiating process group, the planning, executing process group, monitoring, and then closing process group. Each of them relate to each of these project knowledge areas, and we are going to get into detail in subsequent chapters as we go along, but this slide gives you an overview, a high-level overview of the various project management process groups. So for example, if you are looking at the project scope management and monitoring and controlling process groups, we will take a look at how to validate scope and how to control scope. And once again, this is in subsequent chapters that we'll take a look at, but just understand, since we talked about process groups, I figured I'd show you what those look like. Similarly, if you continue forward with these knowledge areas, you have knowledge areas that include project cost management, quality management, resource management, communication management within each of these phases, and they are mapped, so you can kind of go through and just kind of take a look at. And the last 3 are the project risk management, procurement, and then the stakeholder management. So each of these 13 areas within each project phase map to the knowledge areas that we need to know. That's exactly what we are going to cover in each of these chapters. So we're not going to miss any of these knowledge areas. I'm going to highlight and talk about all of them so that you understand the entire, from chapter 1 to chapter 13, the entire guide. And if you wish to take the PMP certification with a little bit of practice and some experience, you should be fairly ready.